right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve, I have a writing workshop for a very fantastic short story that I think gets taught by a lot of us, the Yellow Wallpaper. So here's the context in which I offered this as an offering for my students. So I teach AP Lit. We're in the middle of test prep season, and we have moved on to FRQ2 preparation. So I know a lot of students or a lot of teachers do the March Madness with poems, and I did a March Madness with short stories, but we kind of crafted it around a Sweet 16, just given the length of the short stories and how much time it would take. So I cobbled together 16 of the most frequently taught short stories in the American high school curriculum, and we did a FRQ2 writing workshop in which I demonstrated for students yet again how to pull the strings of my heuristics so that they can craft and construct FRQ2. So I based my exemplars on the Yellow Wallpaper, and they needed to choose one of the other remaining 15 stories. And my reason for that is there's so much stuff on the internet for the Yellow Wallpaper. And my kids, I don't know about your kids, but my kids, I got a lot of them that have a proclivity to cheat and cut and paste. So the other short stories, there's not a lot in the internet in terms of essays that students have written over the years. So just to preserve the integrity of the assignment, I went Yellow Wallpaper to kind of preclude the cheating factor. So before I dive in and show you my heuristics in terms of how to do the intro, the body paragraphs, and the conclusion, please subscribe to my channel. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. And note that all of the slides featured in this video presentation, you can download them. Just look beneath in the description of the video and you will find everything there. So let's ask the first question. Students staring at a blank sheet of paper, we assign this and they ask themselves, so how do I write the intro? And for those that are familiar with my work, you know that my students always go the inverted thesis heuristic. In order to make this make sense, I do something called Bob Rossing my instruction. Pretty much every time I assign a piece of writing, I write the essay with my students, with and for them. And Bob Ross did the same thing with us, right? He would give us a description of the natural landscape we were about to tackle, and then he'd get to the easel and canvas and paint with us. And the thing about him is he used heuristics too. He used something called the wet on wet technique. So what you'll see in this video is kind of how I teach live. I'm going to do the introduction 3 times, and usually I pause and I say, all right, kids, you've seen it 3 times. On your mark, get set, go. Do an intro for your short story. And then I'll bang out a couple syllogistic body paragraphs, and then they in turn follow my lead. It's a great way to demystify the writing process. So I don't know whether or not you equip kids with templates or heuristics, but I find when kids are left to their own devices and just freewheel it without instruction, they tend not to write very cogently unless they're big readers and have that organizational kind of template or structure in their brains working already. So let's move on here. I got some breaking news. I have some top secret news. If you break down any FRQ2 prompt going back to the 1970s, implicit in every prompt are 2 questions, and this is also true for FRQ number 1. And the 2 questions embedded in the language of those prompts are these. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? I'm in favor of the 4-sentence introductory paragraph. I know some teachers like that 1-sentence bagger, but I really think it precludes kids from getting the sophistication point if you go that route. I'm pretty convinced of that. It's just not very skillful. I teach at the college level as well, and I know that my colleagues would blow a gasket if students were to do that in a college course. And it's called the College Board for a reason. So I want my kids to approximate college writing. So what my students do is they take 3 sentences to get to the authorial intent. Some teachers call that universal truth, universal theme, exigence. So you lead with those 3 sentences. And then it's called an inverted thesis because you end with the thesis. And to get to the thesis, you have to answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? And in answering that, this is the space where students will use their terms, devices, techniques. And in particular for the Yellow Wallpaper and all the other short stories, students have to identify correctly and ascertain the meaning of the piece correctly, the most salient, germane, relevant terms, devices, techniques. So if we break down the inverted thesis graphically, it's going to look like this. As I said, you're going to start with the context and background, that universal truth, the pithiness of the piece. You end with the thesis. So it's 3 sentences, universal truth, 1 sentence, construction of meaning. There's a couple of other things that I like to see in the introduction. One is tier 2 level vocabulary. It is an academic paper. Kids need to remember their audience. So I like to see a fair amount of SAT level caliber words in it without students gooning out and sounding contrived. They have to find their wheelhouse and their lane for that. And I have a ton of stuff in my YouTube channel around my Word Study Academy and what I do over the course of the academic year to help kids augment their vocabulary. And then sentence constructs is something that I'm a big proponent of. Strunk and White have this textbook called Write It Right. It's free. You can find it online as a PDF. And they have something called rule number 18, in which they espouse that there's 12 sentence types. And then with those 12 sentence types, you can pattern them 20 different ways. So I explicitly teach my students to be syntactical ninjas so they can make really good choices at the syntactical level in order to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow. And I think that's integral to set kids up to earn the unicorn sophistication point. So the kids really need to get away from short, simple declarative sentence, independent clause, short, simple declarative, that dot rhythm. So let's recap that. Let's talk about the math. 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Without further ado, let's take a look at exemplar number 1. I'll just read it through and then I'll unpack it for you in terms of how that 3 plus 1 heuristic works. So here it is. Women may be born with the innate freedoms bestowed upon them by a higher consciousness, but quickly, almost from day one, they get born into a system of subordination. Equality is not actualized because of the confining restraints of the cult of domesticity, a system separating the genders into an imbalance of power. In effect, men control virtually every aspect of a woman's life, so much so that he has dominion over her mental health. And now we're getting to the construction of meaning. Look at this. Perkins Gilman arrives at these truths through the symbolism of the Yellow Wallpaper and the narrator's epistolatory style. So you can see here in the first 3 sentences, I'm hammering universal truth, right? One aspect of the Yellow Wallpaper that I can craft and argue a full-fledged literary analysis. So that's pretty pithy stuff up there, right? I can definitely get a few paragraphs out of that. And in the last sentence, I got the construction of meaning, right? The symbolism of the wallpaper. And then I'm setting myself up to talk about the epistolatory nature of the piece. You can see that my vocab is up, but it's not contrived. It's not forced. Just good words like innate, bestowed, subordination, things of that nature. And then the other thing in terms of sentence constructs, this is what I preach to my kids. Avoid redundancy, avoid parallel syntax. So if you take a look at sentence number 1 and how it's crafted, sentence number 2 should not be identical to that. That's how you get that droning rhythm. And you move to sentence 3 should not look like number 2, right? You need variety. And then sentence 4 should not look like 3. And then you want to stagger some distance, right? So sentence 3, can it look like sentence 1? Yeah. Is it the most skillful thing to do? Maybe. But typically, if you drop a pattern, you run away from it for a little bit before you revisit it. And that's kind of how I tell my students to consider their sentence constructs. Might be a little nebulous, a little pie in the sky, so let's do it again and take a look at exemplar number 2. High society is actually a degradingly low system of abuse for women during the context of the Yellow Wallpaper. Two gender spheres exist, one that privileges the man, another that greatly restricts women to the point where they are stripped of their God-given rights. When one is beneath the weight of another's oppressive hold of power, it is easy to understand how a mind can break while a great sense of self can take root. Perkins-Gilman demonstrates how these factors operate through the symbolism of the yellow paper and the various ironies of the plot structure. So let's start at the end in terms of the construction of meaning. I call it dropping the seeds of the line of reasoning. I know that in the body paragraphs, I got to get to the symbolism and the ironies because I mentioned it in my thesis, right? It's a promise to the reader. Dear reader, I promise I'm going to discuss these things. So in this intro, I'm making the assertion that those are like super salient points in the piece, which they are. In the first 3 sentences, same as example number 1. It's 3 sentences of universal truth, exigence, like the main aha moment of the piece. Like, why did Perkins-Gilman write this in the first place? What's her point? Right? Vocab is up and the sentence constructs are cooking. So with my students, like they know how to use colons and semicolons and dashes and parenthetical statements and all that stuff because I explicitly teach it early in the year in my nuance academies. So what I'm doing in my modeling, I expect them to be able to do. Yes, you can do this. It's really not that hard. Practice, practice, practice. So number 3 is going to look just like 2 and 1, right? 3 plus 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Here it is. It is essential that one never allow another person to be the one defining their life. Self-definition is so vitally important in creating one's humanness and sense of authenticity, so much so that it is hard to call your life your own without ceasing the power for oneself. The nature of creating such a life and identity is the struggle of finding the language to express the formation of this new identity trying to take shape. So we're at the 4th sentence. Look at the terms, devices, techniques being dropped. Perkins-Gilman's protagonist arrives at this true sense of self through that struggle to create a language that liberates her from an antiquated system of power. So basically sets me up to do tight diction analysis in the rest of this, right? So get a few paragraphs just cobbling that together. So a piece that's this powerful and so loaded, it can go in so many different directions, right? So it's not limited to one pigeonholed thesis. All right, my lovelies, if you're following along with me in painting, give it the old 3 plus 1. Give it a whirl. Try your hand at an introduction. We still got a whole bunch more essay to write, so we got to ask ourselves a fundamental question. So how do I write the body paragraphs? And again, those that are familiar with my work, you know it. Students are going to proceed syllogistically. Let me give a quick rundown of what I mean by that. The syllogistic construct is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often tussle with these juicy questions like, what is justice? Which is at the heart of a classic text, Plato's Republic. And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, was principally concerned with line of reasoning. He called it cogency. And to help his students out, he likewise gave them a heuristic. One day he had a eureka moment. He's like, aha, logic's like math. It's calculative. There's like a methodological approach to it. So a syllogism is when you go from premise, conclusion to structure your thought, to structure your argument. So imagine an instance in which I were to say, premise number 1, arsenic is deadly. Everyone would nod their head and say, yep, Kristian, you are right. But then if I follow it up with premise 2 and say, yeah, my dog kind of got beneath the sink and ate the arsenic that I laid out to kill the rats, you would naturally conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog's going to die. And Aristotle would call that cogency. It's a cogent argument. It's logical, right? When kids write, we're ultimately teaching them to think cogently on paper. So this is why I'm a big proponent of heuristics over templates, because look at what they got to do next if we morph this into a heuristic for the purposes of performing literary analysis. The first premise is going to be an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. Here's my advice to students. If you explicitly stated it up in your thesis, imply it in the first premise. Because again, one of the rules of composition is, avoid redundancies unless you have a point, unless you have a purpose, right? So if you explicitly stated the term device technique in the thesis, imply it in the first premise and vice versa. Use your synonyms, right? So the first premise is a 3-sentence move. And I require 3 sentences because there's a huge fundamental difference between performing literary analysis and plot analysis. The moment that kids begin to summarize or quote in the first, second, or third sentence, they usually shift away from performing literary analysis and they're writing cliff note summations. And we don't want that because the demand of the assignment is to perform literary analysis from top to bottom. So 3-sentence is kind of like a bulletproof way to ensure that they're not deviating from what they're supposed to be doing. And I'll model that in just a second. So the 4th sentence begins the second premise, and this is where you teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing in the form of textual support. And then the conclusion, you got to remember that paragraphs need conclusions too, is where you're going to do your textual analysis and link it all back to the thesis and link it back to the prompt, right? Keep the promise of the first premise. And all of this is going to take 10 to 12 sentences. That's an appropriate length body paragraph to fully substantiate and unpack and prove an argument and flesh it out. So we might be asking ourselves this: Kristian, what's a first premise look like? I got you covered. So typically, my students will begin with the following clause, right from the onset, comma. And I'm not a big fan of prescriptions and formulas and all of that stuff. It's kind of a training wheel. But usually my students ask, where do I begin? And I say, start where the author starts and proceed chronologically through it. So right from the onset, cues the reader into knowing that you have sequence, you have order, that you're going to be very patterned and calculative throughout the piece. But you don't need it. And we're in test prep season right now. And I'm kind of taking the training wheels and the scaffolds away from my students. So I'm not going to use right from the onset, which I usually do in my videos. Look how I begin. I'm still going to go chronologically, but I'm just going to get rid of that device. In many regards, Gilman uses the conventions of the psychological horror tale to critique the institution of marriage and the cult of domesticity, especially as practiced by the respectable classes of her time. In a conventional 19th century middle-class marriage, with its rigid distinction between the domestic functions of the female and the active work of the male, this ensured that women remained second-class citizens, small and much less significant than their counterparts. The narrative device of the epistle format accentuates John's dominion and his wife's seemingly compliance to his superior intelligence. So you can see that takes 3 sentences right there. And give it a reread and kind of ask yourselves, what is Kristian promising here, right? If the first premise is a promise, what quotes and or paraphrases must he have to substantiate this argument? And you can see here, I'm kind of predetermining the quotes and the paraphrases that I can select. And this is a really cool way to write for a number of reasons. One, it precludes students from doing 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax. There's no way in hell you're going to get the sophistication point doing that. That's way too plodding, way too dutiful, and not skillful enough for students who have taken a whole battery of AP classes. So I'm multitasking in here. I got a couple of promises. That's what I mean by multitasking. There's a couple of things I got to prove in my remaining like 8 sentences or so. So what I tell my students to do after they write their first premise is go fetch some support. Keep the promise of the first premise, right? The quotes and paraphrases need to link up and be germane to the promise of the first premise. So fourth sentence begins the second premise. Let me show you what I got cooking here. Language is power. And while John sees his wife trying to give voice to her changing sense of self, he quickly puts the brakes on it. The narrator is quick to tell us that John has cautioned her not to give way to fancy in the least. He says that with her imaginative power and habit of story making, a nervous weakness like hers is sure to lead to all manner of excited fancies, and that she ought to use her will and good sense to check the tendency. So let me explain this here. One thing my students do well is embed their quotes. Their quote transitions tend to be very conversational. And there's an easy hack to this, and I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, you also observe that I bracketed quite a bit in that. It should sound conversational. Usually it's pretty bulletproof. So I want my students quoting in sentence 4 or 5. Otherwise, they're just bloviating too long to set up the argument. You got to get into the textual support in sentence 4 or 5. When you quote, you got to analyze it. So I like transitions like this. In other words, right, you're cueing to your reader that you're performing diction analysis. In other words, John is suggesting that he's of superior thought as a man, so therefore should be left to do the thinking for even his wife. Within this time, this is normal. Let the man seize total control of the woman. Now, we got to be mindful. We made a whole bunch of promises in that first premise. So we got to go get some more textual support. We don't want to belabor that quote and prattle on and on and on and on. We're good. We got it. The journal is an essential place for the narrator to give voice to her thoughts. With a very sincere, almost heartbreaking tone, she shares in her journal that John and her tried to have a real earnest, reasonable talk and tell him how she wished he would let her go and make a visit to cousin Henry and Julia. But he said she wasn't able to go. She did not make out a very good case for herself, for she was crying before she had finished. Even the self-expression of crying is weakness and madness. Despite the desire to have a conversation as equals, John yet again controls the strings, right? So you can't end there. We got to get all the way back to the thesis, really shore up the promise of the first premise and hammer the prompt. So you got to conclude the thought, right? The syllogism's kind of like a circle. So the conclusion to the syllogism usually takes like 2-3 sentences, no more. So look how this comes full circle on itself. The day spent alone in that room with a head full of thoughts is what ultimately led to the formation of a language that produced a sense of liberation and self-acceptance. Forming the words was the necessary action needed to broker the change to gain a sense of independence and freedom. And that's one body paragraph, right? So if you're writing with me, pause and give your hand a try at doing a syllogistic body paragraph. You got to ask yourself, though, what do I do next? And it's very easy, and this is where the whole process of writing gets demystified. It takes the guesswork right out. You bust out another syllogism. On all FRQs, whether I've taught AP Lang for over 20 years and AP Lit for over 20 years. My students every year have done 4-paragraph essays for both exams. So intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. You basically got to ask yourself this: what's left? Because in terms of analyzing the short story, there's still a whole bunch of other rocks we've not even overturned yet. So we can go in many directions. So you just redo that first premise, take 3 sentences, switch up the terms, devices, techniques, switch up the quotes, make sure you land a conclusion on it, 10, 12 sentences. It's that easy. So in my class, I would model that for students, but teachers, that are watching this, give your hand a try at it and model for your kids. Bob Ross, your instruction. So that takes care of 3 paragraphs. Let's wrap the essay up. What do I do as far as conclusions? Early in the year, I give my students stems that look like this. And I ultimately tell them that a conclusion paragraph is like the grand finale of a fireworks display. You want to hammer exigence. You want to hammer the big, juicy theme of the piece. So stems that say something like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day, in a global sense, seem to do a good job at it. I don't think it's the most skillful thing to do, but it works, and students usually take 3 or 4 sentences to do it. As we near exam time, I teach my kids other ways to tackle the conclusion to be more skillful, especially my kids that are in contention to earn overall scores of 4s and 5s. I really don't want them doing this. It's a little too plodding, a little too dutiful, a little too elementary, but it works for the purposes of meeting conventions. So it's fine. So I'm signing off. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you need to reach out to me for any reason, like if you want me to make a video, consider a video, just feel free to drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Any questions, comments, direct them my way. I always respond to my emails. I also have a web page, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. I'm pretty active in the ELA circuit, so I've been doing webinars for applied practice, perfection learning. I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. Present with NCTE, do a little work with the College Board. So I have a calendar of events up there. Most of my professional developments are free, especially the webinars. Some are for a nominal fee, so you can go there and check it out. So let me tell you what I got cooking on the burners in terms of professional development going forward. So with the National Writing Project, for years now, I've been running my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind. And one of the overwhelming statements that in the evaluations is this: teachers almost uniformly say this: I wish I could have taken this one-on-one with you, because my needs are so specific. My kids are so unique. My district is so unique. My course load is so unique. So what I've decided to do is offer a Teach It Right 5-week one-to-one mentorship. So what we can do is over 5 weeks, and again, you choose the schedule. We'll align our schedules. We meet 5 times, 90 minutes a pop, and we basically tailor make the instruction towards your needs. So we can get into my Nuance Academy, my Word Study Academy, unpack the heuristics across the expository modes, even get into my alternative grading methods if that's something that you're interested in. So on my webpage, I have a whole bunch of information on that. You can check it out. Some districts have said, hey, can you work with 3 of our teachers and get them vertically aligned? I absolutely can do that, and I even travel to districts if you want that. Just drop me an email. I know that some teachers are super booked and they're like, I don't have time for 5 weeks. So I made a self-paced course. It's a compilation of 10 videos. It walks you through my heuristics as they apply to each and every of the expository modes. And I have videos for AP Lang, AP Lit, all the FRQs, to teach those explicitly in a Bob Ross fashion. It has my alternative grading methods in there, the Word Study Academy, the Nuance Academy, all there. Again, check the website or drop me an email if you want more information on that. It's pretty cool. I honestly think this is one of the best self-paced course in the ELA circuit. I really put a lot of love into it, and I studied other courses and tried to improve upon it. And the last thing is this: I offer my alternative grading method seminars a lot during the academic year. And again, teachers say, man, Kristian, I wish you could offer that one-on-one because my grading needs are so specific. So I'm doing the alternative grading methods 2-hour intensive. Again, I can do this one-on-one, or I can do it with your department or just a few colleagues so that you guys can reclaim your evenings and weekends. The big kicker is you kind of got to use my heuristics for this in order to do the alternative grading methods, but it's a guaranteed way for you to not take work home and get your evenings and weekends back to some semblance of sanity. So that's it from here. In the weeks, months, days, years to come, I'll continue to make videos, and I'll